I mean, there's a lot in the sources that makes this battle just seem like this most incredibly cinematic event. You sort of have the initial attacks up the hill in the early morning, coming across the marshes through the morning mist. This battle that goes on all day. William showing himself this incredible leader.
4 or so Norman knights targeted Harold, went for him towards the end when things are starting to unravel. They charged towards him and hacked him down. And they use this euphemistic phrase saying they cut off his thigh, which apparently suggests the manhood.
Hello. On the 14th of October 1066, two armies faced each other on the south coast of England. One, under Harold Godwinson, was tired after marching from the north, but had the high ground. The other was a foreign force, led by Duke William of Normandy. The result of this battle, not far from Hastings, would have major ramifications for European and world history. Joining me are two writers to discuss the events leading up to Hastings, the claims on the English throne, the battles beforehand, and the characters involved. Adam Staten and Paul Bernardi are the authors of a series of books set during the Norman invasion, so links are in the show notes. Plenty more history on the way, including Richard II and Henry IV, the Battle of the Bulge, and a naval history of Britain. But until then, I'll hand you over to me talking 1066 with Adam Staten and Paul Bernardi. Adam, Paul, welcome to the pod. This is very exciting for me, talking about the most, I think it's fair to say, the most significant event in, well, I would like to argue world history, but at the very least English history. I think we'll go with world history.
I don't think you get an argument from us. No, that's fine.
No, yeah, I think we'll agree. Yeah.
Good. So 1066. Well, actually, we're talking the Battle of Hastings, 1066, but we're actually gonna do a bit of lead up for the listeners, and actually for my benefit too. So I was saying to Adam before we started recording, Paul, that I think last time I studied this, I was 9 or 10 years old. I think to get your insight, you're both novelists for historical fiction of the period, which I know full well involves a huge amount of research. So there are links in the show notes for both your books. And actually, you've done series. So why don't I kick off first? Adam, you've just produced the second of a, I think, is it going to be a 3?
Yeah, it's going to be a trilogy. Yeah, so we're working on the third one now. Yeah, actually, I think, as you say, before we started the recording, we were talking about where to start this story, and my first book starts in 1064 with Harold Godwinson's trip to Normandy. Absolutely fascinating thing to research. Something I hadn't really realised is that a couple of years before they face off against each other, that's Harold and William on the battlefield at Hastings, they actually fought side by side in Normandy on a campaign that Duke William, as he was then, was leading against Brittany. And the reason for Harold being in Normandy is a bit mysterious. There's a number of different theories, but basically it's quite an exciting story. He ends up shipwrecked on the coast near Normandy, and then taken as a captive to Duke William's palace. And then, as I say, he joins Duke William on a campaign, and then ultimately, famously, according to the Normans, he gives his oath to William that he will support William's claim to be king, which is then when he becomes king himself in 1066. William, declares him to be an oath breaker and says that it sort of legitimizes the conquest, really.
So William, when he had Harold in captivity, when William says he came to some kind of agreement, what exactly were the kind of claims that the two of them had?
Well, this is the Harold's claim. Essentially, is his claim to the throne is really by dint of him being the most powerful man in England after Edward. His sister is married to King Edward the Confessor. He is the biggest landowner after the king. Two of his brothers are also earls, so the Godwinson family have England pretty much sewn up. And at the point when King Edward the Confessor dies, the English know there's going to be this huge threat. They know that William is going to come from Normandy at some point, and they know that Harold Hardrada is probably going to have a go at some point, and they need a strong leader. There is no automatic succession in England at this point, so anybody who succeeds the crown has to be voted in by the Witan, which is the Council of Noblemen. And so that's Harold's claim is really just by being the best man for the job, or at least in my opinion, he looks like the best man for the job. William's claim is pretty spurious. He is distantly related to Edward the Confessor. Edward's mother was Emma of Normandy, who's a distant relative of William, so they're kind of distant cousin. William also claims that Edward had offered him the throne back in 1051. Not really clear why Edward would have done that at that point, but that was William's claim. And then, of course, he claims that Harold supports that in 1064 or thereabouts. So that's his claim, which is a bit tenuous.
I think one of the problems we've got, as Adam says, we're not really sure of some of these things, right? One of the problems we've got here is that obviously you've got propaganda at play, haven't you? So the Normans are keen to present one version of truth, and the English are keen to present another version of truth. Or, as we see with the trip to Normandy by Harold in 1064, I don't think English sources really mention it. It's only sometime later, Eadmer, who's a monk in Canterbury, if I'm not mistaken, he comes along and says, actually, he went of his own accord in order to try and secure the release of his brother and his nephew, who'd been held as political prisoners, effectively, since 1051 by William. And so he thought, well, I'm going to go over there and try and get them back. And you got this interesting scene on the Bayeux Tapestry where I think it perhaps starts with it, or it's very near the beginning, where Harold is talking to somebody, presumably Harold, we're not sure, but he's kind of looks like he's kind of giving him a bit of a ticking off maybe. And I start to weave theories around this kind of stuff, and it seems to me that Harold is kind of saying, I'm off to go and try and get Wulfnoth and Hakon back. And Edward's saying, don't be an idiot, because you do that and you're going to play straight into his hands. Potentially, it's one theory. And I think the other theory that's in my mind as well about how we end up in a situation where William is saying, I have a claim to the throne from 1051 is, I think there was an unquenchable hatred between Edward and Godwin, which goes back to when Edward and his brother Alfred, they've been in Normandy since 1016 when Canute conquered England. And so they've been there for the best part of a quarter of a century. And at one stage, I think it's in the 1030s, they try and come back to England, try and launch an invasion. It's probably about the time when Canute dies and he got his son taking over. So Alfred does land. Alfred's his brother. And the suggestion is that we know he was murdered. His eyes were put out effectively, and I think he died of his wounds. He died of the pain and infection probably. And the suggestion is Earl Godwin was behind that. Again, nothing can be proved.
Earl Godwin is Harold's father.
Harold's father, yes, sorry, yeah, Godwin. And then Harold Godwin's son. So the suggestion is that Edward certainly believed that Earl Godwin was behind the murder of his brother, which again links into the next bit, which is, as Adam said, he's married to Harold's sister, Edith, I think it is, but they never have any children. Now, that could just be a biological thing, but there's certainly some sources, I think it was the life of Emma, one of the sources, claims that Edith had said they'd never actually consummated the marriage.
Couldn't stand to have his father-in-law as grandfather of...
It's a theory, and it's one that I kind of quite like to say that, Edward would do anything other than have a Godwin on the throne.
Fascinating.
Which becomes very interesting when you get to the deathbed scene, but go on.
You've mentioned some sources there, and the Bayeux Tapestry. I mean, the Bayeux Tapestry is produced obviously after the Norman invasion by its very name, and so is probably propaganda. But Adam, what are the sources we kind of deal with?
Well, I think this is something that Paul's alluded to, really. The English sources prior to the conquest are pretty sparse. As Paul said, they make no mention of Harold even going to Normandy in 1064. A lot of what we rely on are sources that come afterwards. So you have things like the Bayeux Tapestry and writers like William of Jumièges, who's a Norman. And you have some English chroniclers, people like Aldrich Vitalis, who are writing after the event. So everything's clouded by hindsight. A lot of it, particularly the Norman sources, is essentially propaganda justifying why the Normans are there. And then we have some later sources. You mentioned Edmar and William of Malmesbury. There we go, William of Malmesbury, who are writing a bit later, and it's not quite clear what they're basing their accounts on. Is it oral tradition? Are they written sources that are lost to us? But basically, everything you read, you have to take with a pinch of salt because so much of it contradicts each other, and there's very little of it to start with.
Great. Well, luckily we have the two of you to guide us through here. Yeah. So it seems as though if we're up to speed now, Harold has managed to get back to England, having been released by William on the agreement that William will be king. So that's the story according to William. So when Edward the Confessor dies, Harold, you mentioned that Harold was aware that he would have two rivals, Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy. So who is Harold Hardrada and what is his claim on the throne, Paul?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Harold Hardrada, I think, is one of the most fascinating people of the era. If you've got the right TV channel that you can watch, is it Valhalla Rising, I think, which is kind of the follow-on from the Viking series, which, okay, there's a lot of liberty being taken with the history, but it's following kind of Harold Hardrada through his youth when he flees Norway because he's loser on a battle, I think, in which his brother is killed. He flees Norway, goes down the river system, as the Vikings often have, through the Rus and down all the way to Byzantium. And while he's there, he ends up pretty much the bodyguard to the emperor. He's a fascinating guy who gets up to all sorts of shenanigans. But I guess as he's getting older, he comes back to Norway and he then spends, a good period of his life getting control of Norway and then trying to extend that control into Denmark as well. So he wants to be sort of king of Norway and king of Denmark. But in terms of his claim to England, I'm not sure he's got one really. Or, I mean, okay, you could look back to the time when Canute was king of Denmark and king of England, and maybe he wants to, reinvigorate that kind of idea. But I've got him down more as someone who likes violence and someone who likes opportunity. So obviously we've got Tostig, who's Harold's brother. I guess most people will know that they had a falling out, and Tostig he went a few places, but he went eventually to Norway, to Hardrada, and basically pitched an idea to him that said, give me some help and I could see you possibly king of England if we can knock my brother off. Maybe give me Normandy and you can have, the overall title. So I don't know if Adam's got a different view, but my view is he didn't really have a claim to England, but was just thinking, one last adventure. I'm in my 50s. One last adventure, see a bit of fun, smack a few heads, see how we get on.
Yeah, I agree with you. He was, he is a fascinating character. I mean, there's also, he was a poet and he was in love with a Kievan princess and things. So it's a really interesting character, and I think essentially he was just, an empire builder taking a chance on England. There is a very tenuous claim, which goes back to King Canute, who was succeeded by Arthur Canute. Arthur Canute, I think, was king of Denmark, but had agreed with the king of Norway that if, let me get this right,
whoever died
first, Magnus would take over the kingship of Denmark and England. It turned out that Magnus died first. Hardrada took over that claim. It's extremely tenuous, but there is some kind of twisted logic in there. But I think he's just an opportunist, essentially, I think. Yeah.
Right. Well, this is just giving me more and more sympathy for Harold Godwinson, I've got to say, because he's now got one king, one duke, breathing down his neck for the throne of England. Now, the reason I have sympathy for Harold Godwinson because I always had thought, well, possession is 9/10 of the law. He's king. It's not fair of what William did, which I know is rather is a very childish way of looking at it. But with such tenuous links, really, in this era, we're looking more at who is the best at fighting. Is that really what decides who's going to become the king?
I wanted to come back on that from something like Adam said at the beginning. I alluded to it earlier about the deathbed scene with Edward the Confessor. So Edward the Confessor dies on the 5th of January. Harold is crowned on the 6th of January. That is pretty much unheard of, I think, in terms of the haste with which that happens. You've also got someone we haven't mentioned who's on the scene, which is Edgar the Atheling. Now, he, again, it's not tenuous. He is the last surviving male member of the House of Wessex. And as Adam says, there's no definitive right to kingship in this era. But if you take Canute out of the equation, for the last sort of 250 years, it has always been a male of that family, often the son, but also brothers. I mean, remember Alfred the Great, right? He was the fifth brother, I think, to succeed in succession. So it's going brother to brother to brother. And then it started going Harold's son and Harold's grandson. So Harold Godwinson stands out as a huge anomaly in that he's the first one not to be a member of the royal family of Wessex. So again, I've got this kind of view in my head that says he was kneeling next to Edward at the point Edward breathed his last, and kind of leaned in and said, "What's that, Your Majesty? You want me to take over the throne? Oh, good idea. Okay." And then I know I'm being a bit facetious here, and then the Witan is there because everyone knows Edward's dying, and they're all there probably for Christmas anyway, celebrate Christmas. So he can pull the Witan together very quickly. He's got a lot of supporters on the Witan. And again, same accusation maybe as Harold Hardrada. He's a great opportunist. I absolutely agree he was the right man for the job at the time in the circumstances that were facing England. But it should have been Edgar Atheling. He was passed over effectively because he didn't have the support. He's a young lad, about 13, 14. He's grown up in Hungary. He's born and grown up in Hungary. And he's come back to England 1057-ish with his father, Edward the Exile, who then dies within 3 weeks of stepping off the boat. Foul play suggested, but not proven. So he was never going to win an election because he didn't have the support or the backing. So Harold saw his opportunity and took it.
Okay, so this is January 1066. Harold becomes king. So presumably we're in the winter season. The rivals to the throne are not going to attempt an invasion in the winter. So they're going to wait, and that's why we're looking at towards the middle and towards the end of the year for the respective invasions. Most school children will know Stamford Bridge, then Hastings. Was that always going to be the best approach? Because Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy invade within weeks of each other, don't they? So was that always the right approach to take by Harold Godwinson, to go first for the Viking threat and then later William of Normandy? Adam, I'll ask you.
Yeah, so the sequence of events, the time delay for the Norman invasion is partly due because it's such a huge undertaking. William had to build hundreds of boats, he had to gather support and all the rest of it. So it was pretty well telegraphed that William was coming. The invasion from Hardrada, I think, is a bit more opportunistic. As Paul said, Tostig, who's Harold's brother, has gone over there and has sort of talked him into it. But through the summer of 1066, Harold Godwinson is actually down on the south coast with an army and a navy defending the south coast, waiting for this invasion to come. But the winds aren't right. Anomalous weather conditions, they just couldn't get across. Various attempts. At one point, they did launch the boats and then got driven back onto shore. But essentially, it gets to the point where Harold thinks the army isn't coming, the invasion isn't coming. I will send the army home because they're all peasant farmers. They need to go home for the harvest. So he sends them home, thinks we'll be safe for the autumn. At that point, he finds out that Hardrada has landed to the north, and that's why he then has to rush north. There is a battle before Stamford Bridge, which is the Battle of Fulford Gate, which is where the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, who are two brothers, fight against Harold Hardrada, and they lose. And actually what happens is they lose that battle, and Harold Hardrada is at Stamford Bridge waiting to receive tribute and hostages from their defeated army. He's not aware at all that Harold's coming north, Harold Godwinson's coming north, and that's why he's taken completely by surprise. And that element of surprise is one of the reasons why Harold Godwinson wins Stamford Bridge.
Right. So, Paul, in this era of warfare, are we really looking at? Many listeners may have watched the TV show, based off the Bernard Cornwell novels, The Last Kingdom. Is this really where you've got knights? They're not mounted, but they are sort of shields, big shields, chainmail, and it was on foot. The battle between Stamford Bridge is on foot. It's sort of heavy infantry bashing up against each other.
Yeah, there's a nice little detail about Stamford Bridge, back to Adam's point about the fact that Harold Hardrada was taken completely by surprise, because it's supposedly a very hot late September day, and a lot of the Vikings, Norse I should say, had left their armour back at the boats, about 12 miles away, I think. And so, they're thinking of a bit of sunbathing and stuff because it's a nice day and it's too hot for your armor, and we're only just going to pick up some hostages and such like. So I think that certainly helped Harold Godwinson, because it's a lot easier to kill a man who's not wearing a mail shirt. But yes, effectively, what you're saying is absolutely right. It's and as happens in the Bernard Cornwell series on TV, it's two groups of men pushing and shoving against each other. Now, I often think that, certainly the Saxon army is made up of two main contingents. One is what we call the Huscarls, which are literally, I guess, hearth warriors, people that are elite soldiers that are employed directly by the Lord just for the purpose of fighting effectively or defending, whatever they need to do. So they'd be the heavily armored ones with the mail shirts and the helmets and the swords, potentially, because swords are still quite rare, I guess, because they're so expensive. And then the rest of the army is, as Adam said earlier, is the sort of peasant farmers, or, people that towns and cities are required to provide by way of military service for a period of the year. Now, they're going to be lighter armored. They may have the odd helmet handed down, I guess, or padded jerkins maybe as armor, padded leather jerkins, but they've got spears. So I think the Huscarls will be in the front rank, and the Thirdsmen, as they're called, will be behind with the spears, trying to get somebody over the top with a spear. But yeah, I've often, in research of battle scenes, obviously, because battle scenes feature quite heavily in both of our series of novels, but in that research, it's often said that there's not many actually people killed in the shield wall because they're so tightly packed and you haven't got a lot of room to swing a cap, really, let alone a sword. But it's really when one side breaks, that's when the slaughter happens. So as soon as one side buckles, turns and runs, they just get mown down. So I think you've seen it in archaeology at times when you find burial pits from battles. You see a lot of injuries in the back because people are running away and they're getting hacked at by pursuers, effectively. So I think whilst it was a stunning victory, Stamford Bridge, so partly he was helped because he did outnumber the Vikings, I think, because they hadn't taken their whole force, and partly because they didn't have their a lot of them didn't have their armor with them. So combination sort of weight of numbers, I think that kind of caused the Vikings to actually break in the end, and they were significantly slaughtered. I think, again, nice little detail that they supposedly came over in 300 boats and went home in 24. So I think some significant damage.
Yeah, the scale is extraordinary. And Adam, Hardrada is killed in the battle, isn't he?
Yes, he's killed, as is Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig. So it's a bit of an annihilation, as Paul has suggested. According to legend, just before the battle, Harold Godwinson had ridden up to Harold Hardrada, his force, and said to his brother, in fact, Tostig, you surrender, I'll give you the earldom back, and send these Vikings away. And Tostig told him to nap off. And Harold Godwinson promised that he would give Harold Hardrada 7 feet of English soil, was what he'd earn. So he was taller than most men, so he could have 7 feet, not the 6 feet you'd normally use to bury someone. And so that's what Harold Hardrada got in the end.
Fighting talk, yeah.
Fantastic stuff. Fantastic. Okay, so Harold Godwinson now has dealt with one threat, which before the battle, on paper, was Harold. Would he have been considered the favourite in would the Saxons have been up against the Norsemen? Would that have been considered an evenly matched battle, or was it always because the Norse, it seems to me, are the sort of the preeminent fighting force of the era?
North are very feared, but I've read sources that said that the Anglo-Saxon Huscarls were essentially considered the most feared warriors in Europe. Now, whether that's just Anglo-Saxon propaganda, but I read something that they thought that a Huscarl was worth 4 Viking warriors. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. But so it's
definitely true, I think.
Yeah, it sounds true to me. Yeah. So the Anglo-Saxons were a formidable fighting force. The only contrary point to that really is that a lot of the army was made up of these fieldsmen who weren't professional soldiers, whereas you would expect the Viking force essentially to be more hardened warriors, I suppose. I don't know what you think about that, Paul.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think they're the people that coming across in the boats for the purposes of having a scrap. I think they're going to be more used to being fighting warriors rather than, as you say, people that have called up off the farm for 8 weeks to. I guess they all train, so they're not a stranger to a shield and a spear and standing in a shield wall. It'd probably like in the Middle Ages when the kings used to mandate that people practice their archery on a Sunday. For like the Crécy and Agincourt. I wouldn't be surprised if the same thing's happening here, that people are required to train with spear and shield every now and then in their towns and villages to make sure that if they were pulled up, they know one end from the other.
Yeah, well, I always think that even if it wasn't mandated, if I was some villager somewhere and I knew that there was a chance of me standing against the Viking shield wall at some point, I'd probably want to practice a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so at what point then does Harold discover that William has landed on the south coast?
So Harold, after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, goes back to York, bit of a feast, and sort of enjoy themselves and say, well done, and all the rest of it. While he's in York, that a messenger arrives to say that the Normans have landed in the south. The Normans landed about 2 or 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It's towards the end of September. So if you think about how long it would take for a rider to get from the south coast to York, with changing horses every now and then, you're still talking a few days, aren't you? 3 or 4 days. So Harold must have stayed in York for quite some time after the battle, I guess, resting and getting people's wounds treated and the rest of it. As Adam alluded to earlier, right? He was firmly convinced that it was too late in the season for the Normans to risk a channel crossing. It's treacherous in the autumn time with the storms that can blow up out of nothing. So he must have thought, okay, we'll deal with the Norsemen up north, but that'll be it for the year. So I imagine it must have been a devastating blow when the messenger arrived and said, we've got the Normans now.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions since Christmas is coming. Now back to the show. Okay, so that means he has to head south fast. They cover the ground very quickly, don't they? And actually, his manoeuvring throughout these series of battles is pretty impressive, isn't it, Adam?
Well, it is astonishing, really, when you think about it. I mean, think after he left York, it took 8 days to come back to London, which I think is 190 miles. So you think of that as a sort of forced march that's, between 20 and 30 miles every day for 8 days, having just fought a battle, having also just marched all the way up there. It is a remarkable feat. And then it's basically then he's down in London by, I think, the 6th of October. Battle of Hastings ultimately takes place on the 14th. So there's about, give or take about a week. And it's really what he does then in London where there's, which is a bit contentious, is, should he have rested there? Should he have gathered his forces? Should he have taken more time to strategize? Or should he do as he did, which was just press straight on to fight William? And I think that's really where a lot of criticism comes is should he have been a bit more circumspect about taking on William?
I'm wondering what William's doing this whole time.
There's some scenes on the bio tapestry around this. So, I mean, I think it's part of the reason why Harold does what he does. So William is basically, say, he lands at Pevensey, moves a bit inland to where battle is. And he's sending out his mounted soldiers to pillage and ravage and, steal food and cattle and everything, because, he's got to feed his army, but he also wants to cause fear, I guess, fear and terror. And obviously that word gets back to Harold in London that, people are being murdered and villages and towns burnt to the ground, which are the scenes you can see in the bio tapestry. And I guess what Harold's thinking, I mean, I agree with Adam, right? If he'd waited in London for a bit longer, more troops would have come in, because he's come south with the Huscarls, but the Fyrdsmen are coming in from the south. That hadn't fought at Stamford Bridge. There's loads of people in the south of England that were going to come in to fight for Harold. If he'd waited for them longer, then I think the outcome could have been significantly different. But it's the fact that William is ravaging these lands, and they're Harold's own lands, right? It's not just another part of England where he might think, okay, but they are his ancestral lands, so it's his people that are being killed. So I think that plays heavily on his mind, that he needs to be out there, because the duty of the Lord at the time is to protect his people. So he can't really stand by and watch them being slaughtered and do nothing. But also I think he thought, maybe I can repeat the success of Stamford Bridge. Right? I came out of nowhere. He wasn't expecting me, and I slaughtered them. So maybe he's thinking, maybe the same tactic works against William. Get down there quick, catch him when he's not ready, and do the same job.
I think it's also really interesting here to speculate about the influence his time in Normandy had on him. So we mentioned earlier, being in Normandy, 1064, probably. He's one of the few people in England who's seen the Normans fighting. He knows how they operate, how they do battle, how they campaign. And the major difference between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons is the Normans are largely mounted, move very quickly around the country, and this cavalry sort of hit and run tactics can devastate wide areas quite quickly. He has that knowledge, and I wonder whether, yes, his own lands are being ravaged, but is part of him thinking, I need to get there quick because at this point they're camped on a headland, so he can actually hold them there. Do I get down there quickly, hold them to battle? Because if he lets these guys loose in England, it's going to be a long time before we can get them to battle, and the devastation they'll cause could be massive. And as Paul said, he has had this successful sort of, raid up north to take Harold Hardrada. And actually, just a few years before, he had also had a very successful sort of lightning raid into Wales, where he'd taken on, I think, King Gruffydd of Wales, and had stormed into Wales and sacked this guy's palace. So it's a tactic that's worked well for him in the past. So you can argue that he could have waited, he could have built his army up, could have rested a bit more, but it's not completely irrational. What he did is, there's good justification for what he did, basically.
Yeah, it's so interesting, this battle ultimately, because you see it represented on the tapestry, and there's the backstory which you've gone through. So it does suggest that there's one element that makes it so fascinating is the fact that it seems to be personal between the two, which you don't generally get with William ravaging Harold's lands. Was it something that was personal between the two?
It's a good question. I mean, I think the ravaging was designed to provoke. Right? I think William, because William must be thinking he's on the other side of the channel from his homelands. Obviously, the longer he stays there, the more chance there is that they're going to start succumbing to disease, which, the perennial problem of any army in the field, or run out of supplies. Right. So I think he's thinking, I've got to kind of bring this to a tipping point quickly. So what's the quickest way I'm going to get Harold to come down? Start murdering his own kind of people. But then I think, yes, I think William probably did believe that Harold had usurped his claim. It comes back to that point about 1051, where the Norman sources say that Edward offered the throne to William, and we've got no verification that it happened, but I think it's thoroughly believable. I think the last thing Edward the Confessor wanted was a Godwin on the throne, which is why he hadn't produced any children with Edith, unless it was biological reasons. And so I think William did have a kind of burning anger to say, well, hang on, this is my throne. I deserve it. It was promised to me, and you've usurped it. And he went to the Pope to get papal blessing, and it's recorded how William went into battle carrying, one of his soldiers carrying a papal banner before him. So it's effectively a crusade in a sense from that point of view, because he's saying, Harold has broken the law of God by usurping this offer of a throne. So, yeah, I think there's an element of it. And I don't know if you'll get onto that now, maybe a bit later, but I think you kind of see that in potentially what happens to Harold on the battlefield.
I think that you just sort of elaborate on what Paul said. There is a story that when William finds out that Harold has become King of England, he is absolutely incandescent with rage, almost speechless with rage. So certainly, however much you believe the claims he certainly believed he had a right to it. And from his point of view, I think it's personal. But I do think this period of history is just so fascinating because everything's so personal. All the sort of geopolitics revolves around these huge personalities, and they're ruling and driving events just through the force of their own personalities. They're really, some of these people, you can sort of feel the charisma from the distance of 1,000 years. It's extraordinary, really.
Well, you've mentioned charisma, and a great example of that, Adam, is when William steps off his ship. And you're going to now crush my boyhood vision of this, but he falls, but cleverly picks up the sand and says, see, look, I have England already in my palm of my hand. And now you're going to tell me that didn't actually happen.
I thought that was a story from from later campaigns, Agincourt, other way around, England to France. But maybe, Paul, I don't know if you know that story.
The one Oliver just said. I remember reading it in the Ladybird book of William the Conqueror when I was a kid. Nice little picture of him sort of falling over, and as you say, quickly before the army starts laughing at him, he has to style it out effectively, doesn't he? And say, "Oh, I meant to do that," and as you say, grab the sand and the pebbles off the beach.
If it's in Ladybird, it must be true.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's a little bit of kind of like colouring in by William of Jumièges.
Yeah.
Right, so I'm detecting
Sorry.
a certain amount of scepticism there. Right.
I don't
Okay.
believe that Canute also tried to hold back the waves either, do you?
So, Adam, the battle itself. Now, the two armies are joined. I have been to battle. It's not that close to Hastings, so it's a good 10 miles away, actually, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I'm not quite sure why it ended up being called the Battle of Hastings. It was called the Battle of Hastings fairly soon after the event, though. So
Okay, so what are the numbers we're talking about here, Adam?
no one knows with any certainty, but the numbers I've read are English army of about 7,000 and Norman army a little bit bigger than that.
And so I think you've mentioned before that the Normans are on horseback. Paul, why don't you talk us through sort of the events of the battle?
Key events. Like, I mean, it's supposed to have lasted most of the day, which is, I think, a little bit unusual of the era. Often they could be like an hour, just one side breaks and runs, and that's it. It's all over. But this battle went on for the best part of the day, which shows, I think, how evenly matched it was. I think the Norman army you can actually break up into sort of three sections. Well, you could break it up in two ways. They've got a lot of horsemen, a lot of cavalry, knights. I think they also have foot soldiers. Heavily armed infantry, mail shirts, spears, etc. And they have a large contingent of archers. So, guess what's coming with that part of the story. But then in terms of how they've split themselves, I think you've got William in the centre division. They split into three divisions. So William's holding the centre. On the left, there's Bretons, allied to him, and on the right, other French allied contingents. And in terms of what happened, I think the Normans spent a lot of time battering against the shield wall. So Harold had picked the perfect location. He's on top of what's called Senlac Ridge. Again, if you've been there, you'll know there's a clear slope leading up the hill to where Harold and his army were standing. Great position. All he has to do is stand there like a cliff, and let the Normans kind of crash against the cliff and wear themselves out. And I guess he's hopeful as well that the longer he stands there, the more chance there is of reinforcements arriving from London. So basically, that's how it's set up. I think, as you say, the Normans are kind of crashing against the shield wall, not making much in the way of headway. And then, again, sources vary, but the one I like to go with is that the Bretons on the left, maybe not quite so imbued with the kind of mission that William is on. They're more there for sort of money, I guess. There's a suggestion that some of them start to turn and kind of run. They've had enough. And at the same time, supposedly a rumor goes around that William's been killed. So people are starting to waver, starting to get a little bit dicey for the Normans. So, and this is where you're talking about charisma, Adam. I think this is where William absolutely shows that kind of leadership and charisma. Because obviously he hears the rumours, he rides out into the open, pulls his helmet off and says, look, I'm still here, I'm alive. So he rallies the troops, basically. The Bretons turn around and say, okay, right, fantastic, let's crack on.
And Adam, did that definitely happen?
Well, again, I mean, this is the problem with a lot of our sources being basically propaganda, trying to make William seem like this incredible leader, but it might have happened. It's in the sources. I mean, there's a lot in the sources that makes this battle just seem like this most incredibly cinematic event. You sort of have the initial attacks up the hill in the early morning, coming across the marshes through the morning mist. This battle that goes on all day. William showing himself as this incredible leader. This is bizarre event, which I really hope is true, because I really like this story. But just before the battle starts, essentially a minstrel or a court jester from William's court rides out, a guy called Taillefer, if I'm pronouncing that right. He rides out towards the English, and he stands there, he's on his horse, and he's juggling the sword. He's throwing the sword up in the air while singing a song, especially this chanson de Roland, singing and juggling whilst on top of this horse, riling up the English. And an English warrior runs out to take him on, and Taillefer, without sort of missing a beat, cuts the man down and then charges individually into the English line, takes down a few more men, and then is killed himself. So, I mean, how much of this is all myth and legend, but the whole battle is just filled with these sort of big cinematic episodes, So, I mean, to be honest with you, Paul, I'm sure you will agree, this is sort of a battle that's designed for a novel to be written around, isn't it?
Yeah, and as you say, cinematic, right? I'm still waiting for the Hollywood blockbuster to come out about this era. It's a long overdue, I think.
Exactly. It's strange that it's never really been committed to film, isn't it?
Not from the point of view of a feature film. I think there's just another series coming out, I think, on Netflix or something soon. But
King and Conqueror, I think.
Yeah,
Like yeah.
It's desperately needs a full blown film, I think.
Well, I think we're getting to the end of the battle because there is a faint retreat. Is that right?
Well, this is what I think, as mentioned before, about the Bretons potentially looking about to be routed until they're rallied by William. Again, say sources vary, but there's a theory that when the Bretons start to run, some of the Saxons leave the line, right? They get a bit giddy and think, hey, we've won this, let's charge, and because, as I say, that's where most of the slaughter happens and looting and such, because you get to chase the enemy away and hack them down. The suggestion is that William saw this. It wasn't many, just a few, hotheads, I suppose, but it gave him the idea. And again, I think, Adam, you mentioned earlier about how Normans attack. I think they'd done this before in Normandy, this maneuver, where they send the cavalry up the hill and then pretend to run away. And I think doing that once or twice, I think it does cause the Saxon line, or a significant part of the Saxon line, to break and run down the hill after them, thinking they'd won, falling into the trap, at which point the Normans turn around and slaughter them, because they've no longer got the protection of the shield wall. They're just individual men or small groups that are running down the hill. They get slaughtered. And I think that's the point. Again, Adam, correct me if I've got this wrong. I think that's the point at which Harold's two brothers are killed, Gurth and Leofwin, the Earls of East Anglia and Southern Midlands. But yeah, that's basically spells the end for the Saxons. They lose their tactic and rush down off the hill, or a third of the army maybe rush down the hill.
And it's sort of heartbreaking because this happens sort of as dusk is coming, and if they'd held out till nightfall, then the battle would end. In the dark, not the fight in the darkness. If the battle goes to a second day, you've got probably Harold Godwinson is going to get reinforced. He's still holding the high ground. The Normans have fought a full battle, not got anywhere, no chance of retreat, no chance of being reinforced. So it's just you can sort of see this as the sun is setting. If they just held on a little bit longer, the outcome would have been very different. But history didn't work out like that.
No, because and I think another problem they would have had to deal with is that they would have been leaderless, because as everyone knows, Harold Godwinson meets his end. So he meets his end right at the end of the battle then?
Towards the very end, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's part
last hour maybe or something, yeah.
As part of the chaotic sort of events that Paul described, the defensive line falls apart and he dies in the chaos, I think. Now,
an arrow in the eye, it seems like it would be a fairly common injury, surely, and it is why make something like that up? Could you clear this up for me, Adam?
Well, I think I've certainly read things that Paul's written about. I think I agree with you, Paul, but I think you've got fairly strong thoughts about the real events.
Let's go to Paul then. Yes.
Yeah, I do actually. Thank you. I think there's a few different factors, and I don't want to take up another half hour, because I probably could if I'm let loose. Obviously, you've got the Bayeux tapestry, which supposedly depicts Harold with an arrow in his eye. I mean, some people have said that actually isn't part of the original tapestry, that it was a kind of something that got added in the Victorian times. I don't know how possible or true that is. Obviously, in its favour, it's a fairly contemporary source, not the earliest, but it's a fairly contemporary source from people who are obviously there. But there's an earlier source which is known as my pronunciation, apologies, Carmen de Hastingi Prolio. That means the Song of the Battle of Hastings, right? And in that poem, effectively, or text, it's written by a Norman bishop, Guy of Amiens, and in that it actually says that 4 or so Norman knights targeted Harold, went for him towards the end when things are starting to unravel. They charged towards him and hacked him down. And they use this euphemistic phrase saying they cut off his thigh, which apparently suggests the manhood, shall we say? Because the reason I go for this is because the one thing William has to achieve, if you're thinking about what are his battle objectives, the one thing he has to achieve is to kill Harold. Right? He can't risk Harold getting away and rallying another army, because, William will get weaker. He struggle to get troops over the channel in autumn, winter. Disease will kick in. They'll run out of supplies. So the one thing he has to do is ensure that Harold is dead. So I think it's absolutely feasible that four Norman knights did charge into the middle of that last stand and hack Harold to pieces. Coming back to the propaganda, I think William of Jumièges doesn't mention this because he's an apologist for William. So he thinks, let's airbrush it a bit. Let's kind of use this arrow in the eye story. Doesn't make him out to be a horrible monster kind of thing. But you got to kill the guy at the end of the day. If you want to become King of England, if you want to defeat the Anglo-Saxons, you've got to kill the king. At this era, it's cutting off the head of the snake.
And it's interesting. This is where England is almost a victim of its own success because it's an unusually centralized kingdom. There's not that many kingdoms in Europe at that time where you kill the king and actually, effectively, the central power is gone. So, as Paul says, that's objective number one is kill Harold. Probably a good thing for William that both of Harold's brothers also died on the battlefield, as did many other noblemen. So. It was a pretty unusual battle, which I suppose is the reason why it's so decisive. Pretty unusual in that he did, as you say, cut off the head of the snake and kick the door to the kingdom open.
And so in the aftermath, were the remaining Saxon troops, were they sort of mopped up and not finished off, but they would just return to their farms and homes and things like that?
Again, I think we mentioned this before we started recording, Ollie, that often the battle is presented, when you learn it at school, it's sort of presented, Hastings happens and then William's king. I know I have just said it was a very decisive battle, but the aftermath is pretty messy. So there is this story after the battle where a load of Anglo-Saxons are fleeing and they do mount a sort of counterattack. And there's this thing called the Mal Foth, or the Evil Ditch, where they essentially trapped lots of Norman knights and slaughtered lots of them. And then there is a long period of sort of resistance and an insurgency, effectively, from Anglo-Saxons for a few years afterwards. So the aftermath is pretty messy, but ultimately proves to be a very decisive event.
Yes, our good friend Edgar Atheling makes another appearance at this stage, having been passed over in January. He's in London. By this time, Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, as you mentioned earlier, Adam, they've arrived in London. Anyone who's left in terms of Saxon nobility hierarchy is in London. So initially they're thinking, okay, we'll elect Edgar to be king and we'll carry on a resistance. And again, an interesting point. There was a question about how many kings of England were there in 1066. And the answer on the sheet was 3, but it's actually 4, because Edgar Atheling is a king because he was acclaimed by the council, or whoever was left on the council. And in Anglo-Saxon times, that was enough to mean you were king. You didn't have to be crowned. That was the icing on the cake, right? So the fact that Edgar had been acclaimed means he is the last Anglo-Saxon king, in my humble opinion. People might want to challenge that, but I think that's true. And there is a charter he issued in the 8 weeks or so that he was king to appoint a bishop to the Abbey of Peterborough. So in that act alone, he is acting as a king, saying, yes, I appoint this chap to be the abbot of this monastery. But it was destined to fail. As Adam says, so many of the Anglo-Saxon fighting capability had been lost. But also he was dependent on support. Edwin and Morcar, basically the two biggest nobles left in the country. I guess they saw which way the wind was blowing and retired north, ostensibly to say we'll mount a stiffer resistance up north in the hills or whatever, and fight from there. But basically they went north. And so Edgar had nothing left and no choice but to submit. So that happens, I think, early December in Berkhamsted, of all places. At that point, the door is open for Harold to be crowned. But then, as Adam says, that's not the end of the story. There's several years of resistance after that before he can properly call himself secure.
Well, this has been incredible, actually quite eye-opening. And it sounds like you've both had a huge amount of fun in researching the period for your novels. So we need to run through for the listeners. So if you want to find out more, we've got 2. So Adam, I mentioned at the start, we've got Blood Debt and Oathbreaker.
Yeah.
And I want to get this right. So Oathbreaker's come out just a couple of months ago. Links are in the show notes for those. And when's the 3rd coming out, Adam? No pressure.
Probably about springtime next year.
Okay, excellent. And Paul, now you've written, I think you've got 2. Okay, so one trilogy, Thurkill, the Huscarl Chronicles, that is. Mm-hmm. Latest of which is Thurkill's Rebellion. But this covers the whole the whole period. And then you've just embarked on a new trilogy, haven't you?
Yeah, similar sort of era. So the trilogy. Revenge is the first one, then Battle, then Rebellion. So yeah, Revenge is all about that latter half of 1066, about the experiences of a young Fiscal who's kind of baptism at fire at Stamford Bridge, and then goes on to Hastings. So, and then the following two are kind of in the immediate aftermath of 1067, 1068, and what it means to be living under the Normans. And then the new trilogy. So that started with I have to get confused because they both begin with blood. Mine's Blood Feud, as Adams is Blood Debt. So yeah, Blood Feud is basically now we've pitched up towards Northumbria, around the River Tyne, Hadrian's Wall, that sort of area, which I'm not really bothered about what goes on in the south because it doesn't really affect them. And kings of England rarely go north. I think probably Athelstan's the only one they've seen in kind of 200 years when he went up to Scotland and he stopped at Durham to pay homage to the shrine of St Cuthbert. They don't see kings of England. They don't take an interest in the far north. So there you got basically this idea that there's people going about their business. They've got their own worries and conflicts going on, but then the Normans start to come north, and again documented stuff about rebellions rising up in sort of York and Durham, etc., and then the Normans coming north to deal with them. And then obviously a lot of people may be aware of the harrowing of the north, which was 1068, 69, which is effectively genocide. So that's going to be the subject of the third in the trilogy, I think.
Cheery stuff. So
yeah, I need to find some light in that shade.
No, I'm sure there is. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you both. This has been really, really interesting. And so I was originally planning to release it in the anniversary, which is just we've just missed it. So, but I think any time talking about this whole campaign, it's as you say, it's a rich with theories and history and characters, and so that just leads me to thank you both.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Holly.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do subscribe or follow, and if you could give a generous rating, that would be very kind. Plenty more history on the way, but until then, thank you and good night.